The message today is very personal and applicable, I hope, to our shared lives and covenant together as a religious community, and also our lives in a larger context. The account that I'm about to share with you disturbed me then and still does now. It was September 1993, and the Meadville Lombard Theological School retreat was in session at a rustic center on a college campus in Wisconsin. Every year back then, the Unitarian Universalist seminary, where I was a student, had a retreat for a weekend before the beginning of the semester. It was an opportunity for entering students, faculty, administration, and those who were a bit further along to mingle and get to know each other. There were lots of orientation moments, games, and sometimes light entertainment. On the second night, one of my classmates performed a skit that was supposed to be humorous. It was entitled White Trash Cooking. In the skit, my classmate became the stereotype of a Southern poor person. Everyone laughed at her impersonation, possibly everyone but me. I sat in the dark, shocked at my classmate's portrayal and the lack of empathy she had for poor white people and their plight. They were to be mocked and looked down upon because we Unitarian Universalists were so much better. At the end of the skit, while our classmates applauded, I thought to myself, what's next? Maybe an all-time minstrel show. The minstrel show was an American form of theater developed in the early 19th century. The shows were performed by mostly white actors wearing blackface makeup for the purpose of comically portraying racial stereotypes of African Americans. Minstrel shows stereotyped blacks as dim-witted, lazy, buffoonish, cowardly, superstitious, and happy-go-lucky. The minstrel show was created to make white people feel superior and laugh at those who they considered to be inferior to them. The performance that night, 30 years ago, felt like a minstrel show, and it stuck with me. I have never talked about this with anyone since that time. I thought about talking to the seminary's leadership, but did not trust that they would be sympathetic to my observations, nor did I wish to stand out as the only Southerner at the seminary protesting this portrayal. Like every student back then at the seminary, I was afraid of going before the Ministerial Fellowship Committee, which was renowned for being merciless. One bad letter from a professor or a UU minister and you could forget your career. I'm ashamed that prevented me from talking. Now I would be raising a ruckus. That was not the only time that I had heard classism in a Unitarian Universalist context. A young woman who went through the new members class at the Unitarian Universalist Church in Tennessee with me told me that her sister would probably agree with the basic beliefs of Unitarian Universalism, but she would not recommend our church to her sister because her sister was poor and uneducated and would probably not be accepted by the church's members. The minister also of that church told me confidentially that the year before I joined, an elderly black man attended the church several times and expressed appreciation for Unitarian Universalism, but did not join the congregation. He told the minister that he did not feel that he would be accepted by the congregation. And interestingly, he said so not because he was African American, but because he was poor and uneducated. He stated that it was not race that prevented him from joining, but social class. Social class is not something Americans like to think about. After all, we do not have a society as ranked as in some nations. The message today derives its title from a song in My Fair Lady, a musical based upon a play by George Bernard Shaw, Pygmalion, that is about social class in early 20th century Great Britain. Eliza, the very poor woman, is taken in by these language professors, dreams of an ideal life in which she has adequate food, clothing, shelter, and chocolate. Don't we all? American social class is less obvious, but hardly less pronounced than that of contemporary Great Britain. Middle-class Americans like to think that class distinctions are not apparent in the United States. They like to focus on things like race instead of poverty. They like to ignore the evidence that poverty is still very real in our country, with 20% of Americans living below the poverty line. Once upon a time in the United States, poverty was acknowledged and understood better. When I was younger, during my childhood, it was acknowledged that poverty was experienced across the range of American life, with people of different races experiencing want. Something changed, though. When Ronald Reagan ran for president in 1980, he redefined the universality of poverty. He spoke of white working people in contrast with welfare queens, people of color who were supposedly cheating the government safety net. This is in denial of the truth that even though people of color have been disproportionately poor as a group, compared to Americans of European descent, the majority of poor people are white. This was a mode of playing the race card and blaming people for their poverty, especially people of color. Racism was used to cut social programs serving the poorest in this nation. The irony was that most of the people who lost social services were white. Race and social class are entwined in the American psyche in unrealistic ways, and often to the detriment of us all. In preparation for this message today, I watched a sermon by my colleague in the Unitarian Universalist ministry, Reverend Andy Burnett. Burnett wrote about social class and American religion for his doctoral dissertation. He stated in his sermon on social class that sociologists have 4 measurements for social class in the United States. They are income, wealth, education level, and job prestige. This is a confusing taxonomy, though as one might have a high level of 1 or 2 of those and still not be in a higher class because of others. The most obvious example of this is that college professors traditionally have high education levels and job prestige, and without income or wealth and with student loan debt, some might live near the poverty line. Social class in the United States is confusing and often difficult to measure, but the presence of these traits still form our thoughts and emotions. Do your education and job prestige make you upper class? Does your social class from your background shape your interests and affinities to the degree that you place yourself somewhere in terms of social class that others might not? Does your race or ethnicity cause you to think differently about your social class? When applying income, wealth, education, and job prestige to religious affiliation, though, Burnett states that one can guess a person's social class by where she or he goes to church. He points out that people tend to form a habitat with others who prefer the same kinds of music, sports, movies, books, media outlets, and the company one prefers. These are markers of social class, often in very subtle ways. They are also markers of religious affiliation. When it comes to religion, one can sometimes guess at someone's social class by the religious institution one attends. There are exceptions to that, of course. There are wealthy people who attend Pentecostal churches. There are people of low social status who attend Episcopal churches. There are always exceptions, but there are trends. According to Burnett, when it comes to the religious organizations with a tendency to measure highest in social class, Unitarian Universalists are always either first or second, according to sociological research. I suspect this is mostly due to income or wealth than it is to mostly due less to income or wealth than it is to educational attainment. Often higher educational attainment in terms of degrees earned leads to higher job prestige, higher income, and greater wealth. Unitarian Universalists are very smart people, but that does not necessarily mean we're rich. In some ways, being with smart people was one of the draws to becoming a Unitarian Universalist for me. I found that it was wonderful to be in a room of people who were interesting and enjoyed learning, who asked questions that might have been forbidden in more conventional religions. Even though I grew up in an economically lower middle-class family, the distinctions of social class seemed insignificant at that church. I noticed the class markers, but they were not like expensive cars, jewels, or the like. It was only in private conversations that I realized that the congregation was unwelcoming to some due to social class. As I have traveled on a Unitarian Universalist journey and have been involved with 17 different congregations, I have always analyzed churches for social class. Coming from a different place than most Unitarian Universalists, I've had the opportunity to observe class markers, to be aware of how congregations send codes to make sure that the group remains the same sort of people. Sometimes it's accent, sometimes it's educational attainment, sometimes it's something else, and it's based upon the locality. When I served a congregation sharply divided by social class in rural New England, I discovered that I was not of the preferred social class when I mentioned in a sermon that one of my distant ancestors was a French Protestant, a Huguenot, who came to the United States to escape religious persecution. In the area in New England where that church was located, there were no people of color. The traditional lowest status people were French Canadians who migrated down in the early 20th century to take jobs in the mills. In the mindset of that community, being French was considered lower class. Despite the fact that my ancestor never lived in Canada, my French ancestor put me on a lower social standing, and the wealthier members of the congregation were annoyed that their minister had French roots. Yes, that really happened. Classism has been present in every Unitarian Universalist congregation that I have been affiliated with one exception. And no, this congregation is not the one. The congregation that I served had no evidence of classism, had members who drove trucks for a living and school buses, worked in factories, were waitresses, and construction workers. The congregation intentionally made it clear that your job was not you, that education was wonderful and that one could educate oneself without going to college. In that congregation, the wealthier members were middle class, and the congregation was greatly involved in providing help to local poor. Now, before you imagine that they were some kind of ideal Unitarian Universalist congregation, let me share that the congregation had other issues, and members were overtly homophobic. One of my colleagues in the ministry, now departed, once told me, "Never imagine that there's a perfect place or perfect community. In every Garden of Eden, there's always a serpent." Class is an integral part of the American social landscape. Those who founded this nation were mostly wealthy white men. They sought to found a new nation that did not have the clear differences in social class that were present in Europe. They sought to found a nation in which white men were legally equal. These were not terrible ideals for their time. They found a nation in which social mobility did exist for white men, but not for those who were not white. As Isabel Wilkerson points out in her book, Caste, race became a permanent marker of lowest social status in the United States. Social class is also part of the experience of white people as well. We cannot talk very intelligently about social class because class disparities are not supposed to happen in a society founded supposedly to be different from Europe. We cannot tackle social class very well because we are always in a society in which these definitions are changing. As we endeavor to become a more multicultural, anti-oppressive religious movement, it is important to examine our assumptions and sometimes to challenge them. Class is covertly and overtly an issue in our larger movement. Sometimes we have elitist beliefs that are just the way our communities are. Social class is something that most Americans do not like to think about. Class distinctions counter our nation's founding narrative that we are a nation in which all men are created equal. Some in the Unitarian Universalist movement, even among our clergy, believe that we are a religion of the upper middle class and that we should just accept it. I do not doubt that some of us here this morning might feel the same way. We might think, why change things when we feel so comfortable in our habitat? Does being less bound by social class mean that we will abandon our intellectual edge? And the question that probably encapsulates resistance to the journey towards an anti-oppressive, multicultural approach in our shared faith. If we do become more egalitarian, more welcoming to new people who are different from those found currently in my church, will there still be a place for me? I believe that this is a point of vulnerability. The fear that we have in examining our biases and our assumptions. For me, I came into a Unitarian Universalist congregation seeking a community that accepted me as I was and could sustain me when life was difficult. I sought a religion that would embrace me, even if I changed my faith perspective. I sought a community where I did not have to hide my interests, the kind of place that I could be me, where I could be me, where my nerdiness was not only accepted, but embraced. And I hope you feel the same way. Why change something like that? We Unitarian Universalists are proud of being smart. Really, we are proud of being smarter than most groups of people. When we examine the principles and purposes of the Unitarian Universalist Association, it seems that most people are drawn most to the first principle, the covenant to affirm and promote the inherent worth and dignity of every person. Can we really retain pride in our intelligence and also hold on to the first principle? Reverend Andy Burnett speaks of his dissertation research. He found that working class people were being hurt by the assumptions about them in Unitarian Universalist congregations. They were not treated equally as members and often relegated to tasks in congregations, like serving on the Buildings and Grounds Committee. The difference in social class amongst us can be very difficult. And amazingly, some people who grew up in very poor environments still join our movement. And I'm very grateful for that. One of them was a director of religious education in a church I served. She grew up very poor in a trailer park. See the outline of that I talked about earlier. But she found that she was a Unitarian Universalist. And she dealt with the problems of social class quietly, not making people feel uncomfortable. But I knew that she experienced them. Let me share with you that she was the best director of religious education in any of the congregations I have ever served. She loved our faith. She created innovative worship services, times for all ages, programs, curricula, and she was afraid to get published because people like her did not get published. She needed to be encouraged to believe that she could do what she was doing. I don't believe that Unitarian Universalist congregations were founded only to be clubs for the intellectual elite. But that is sometimes how our churches come across. It is something that we need to examine. This congregation and every Unitarian Universalist congregation has work to do if we are to become about creating the world we want in the depths of our spirit. In our time together, let us examine the role that social class plays in our society, our larger movement, and this congregation. As we journey together, let us change what we can, hoping for a religious community that is more welcoming and more in tune with the values that we affirm. And when someone tells us something about ourselves that we did not know before, may we examine our assumptions. We can speak to the complex reality of social class in the United States. Whatever we've experienced, we can change. Is this unrealistic? I don't think so. But it is a matter of faith. Let us keep faith that our work will build a better world for future generations and all life. Let us keep faith that one day all people will be appreciated and will be welcomed for who they truly are. This is the way of Unitarian Universalism. Let us live this faith to its fullest. So be it. Blessed be. Amen.